Welcome grade 12 law students to one of our first videos in terms of what we're looking at with the law and what we're looking at with this course. So the first thing that we're going to look at here, of course, is what is the law? So we'll just go for some of the basic information here. So if we talk about what is the law, we're talking about how do we define law? What does the law affect? What factors change the law? So these are really important things to consider as we go through the course. We also want to consider what makes a good law, right? Do we have laws that are in place for a good reason, or do we have laws that need to be changed? If we look at who makes the law? Who's affected by the law? Who criticizes the law? Who critiques the law, right? Whose job is it to do these types of things? Are laws just passed and we just follow them blindly? Should we do that type of thing? Whose theories have influenced the law? Who works with the law and who benefits from the law? Who's hurt by the law? These are really important questions that we need to consider when we're looking at how the legal system works and how the justice system works in Canada and around the world. When we're looking at where, we think about, well, where does the law come from? Where is the law enforced? And that might seem like sort of a weird question, but if you talk about things like international law is somewhat unenforceable in many places. So how do we have these types of laws and what do we do with them? Where in Canada do we have different laws? So are laws in Quebec versus laws in Ontario versus laws in New Brunswick, right? So we have differences in regionality for Canada. We look at how is the law made? How is it categorized? How is it enforced? How is it changing? Right? Why do we break the law down into different categories, and what does that mean for the people living in Canada and around the world? If we look at why, we say, well, why do we even have laws? Well, in most cases, we would agree that law is a pretty good thing, but sometimes they go too far. What about laws that are outdated and unnecessary in this modern day? So we would look at those and say, well, why do we even have those laws? Where did they come from? Why were they there in the first place? How do they function? What do they do? Why is it important that they're there? If we look at when, we can talk about how does time affect the law. Laws change over time, and as they should in many cases. And when did Canadian law really begin? Did it start with the sort of colonization of Canada? Did it start with the BNA Act? Did it start with the Constitution? When did we really take control over our legal system? These are all things that we need to consider when we're talking about the law in and of itself within Canada. So if you look at this nice quote from St. Augustine, he says, "Law is like time. I know what it is, but if someone asks me, I know not." That's an interesting way of looking at it. So we'd look at this and say, well, it's a hard thing to define. We'd all assume that we know what the law is. We all know how it works. But at the same time, we can't really necessarily describe it to somebody. So in other words, we look at this, what St. Augustine was saying. He was acknowledging that the concept of law, just like time, is kind of hard to put into words. If we take a dictionary definition of law, it's a system of rules that a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members and may enforce by the imposition of penalties. But here are some important things to consider. The law changes. Law is a reflection of society's politics, economy, religion, and morals. And you look no further than the United States right now to see massive changes and potential changes in the law based on society's political, economic, moral direction that it's taking here in 2017. So the law seeks to protect both the individual and the society that the individual lives in. That's really important. We want to remember that we're protecting everybody within society. At least that's the idea. The law is influenced by what we think is just and unjust. Laws are supposed to be just. Justice and equality and these types of concepts are central and fundamental to the legal system. The law is made by humans and humans are not perfect, so therefore we do have some problems within the law. You have to think about this when you think about the fact that a lot of things that the law seeks to protect are sometimes in conflict with each other. For example, you might look at a law that's been passed to protect your right to adhere to a certain religion, but this law might conflict with someone else's right to operate a business whenever they want. This has to do with, there used to be laws about, again, stores being opened on Sundays, because that was in violation of sort of Christian religion. If you look at laws even about things like abortion, so the argument around this is that a woman's right to make her own choices is in conflict with a fetus's right to life. Laws hopefully resolve some of these disputes, but as you can guess from these examples, the law is not simple. So here's what the law does for us. So as an instrument for society, each law has a purpose which embodies an objective or value of society. Law should basically look to advance the collective principles of our society. So our society believes certain things, and we should be looking at law as a way of advancing those and pushing those ideas forward and improving our society. As a mechanism to resolve disputes, it plays a very important role in mediating societal and individual disputes and conflicts. And this seems like a pretty obvious one. You have dispute with your neighbor, you have dispute with the government. You would go find a legal remedy for this particular dispute. So on the third one, we look at law as a protector of people, property, and rights, as a way to protect and ensure the public safety of individuals and their property. This is more like civil law and tort law and things like that. Ultimately, law is there to provide order in our society, provide stability, predictability, and allows for fair and efficient interactions. Again, this concept of fairness and justice. That's what we're looking for. So where's all this coming from? So what are some of the primary sources of our law? So some of our laws are based on very long history of actions and belief systems such as religion and morality. We look at Canadian laws being heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian heritage. We include teachings from things like the Bible and the Torah. Our laws are also influenced by what we think is moral or right versus wrong. So we look at things as the morality of our law. If you look at Aboriginal influences, you say that, well, the First Nations people had their own set of laws before contact with the Europeans. Things like the Great Binding Law. It describes a formal constitution that gave all members of the tribe a voice and power. This is in some indigenous groups. And you would see reflection of this. The US and the UN have referred to the Great Binding Law when framing their own constitutions. The US Constitution actually takes a lot of things from the Iroquois nations. So you would look at the influence that indigenous groups have had on modern law. One of the things that's a very sort of distinct hallmark of Aboriginal law is this idea of restorative justice. We'll talk more about that a little bit further on, but it's a very interesting concept that's gaining a lot more popularity in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. If we look at Greek and Roman civilizations, they've influenced Canadian law. From the ancient Greeks, we adopted this idea of a trial by jury, which makes sense, right? You have your peers who are going to sit in judgment of you and depending on what you did, make the decision on how you should be punished. A jury allows everyday citizens to participate in the law, which is a very important thing. This idea of a democratic society, we want this. The Romans helped us by codifying laws. In other words, we learned to record and systematically collect our laws. Before that, in some cases, they weren't written down. I mean, you look at the Code of Hammurabi, which was carved into stone, but this idea that we are codifying laws so anyone can look them up and they stay consistent. This also really gave us the idea of lawyers because the code became very complicated and we needed people whose job it was to interpret the code and to argue the code and to talk about the code. If we look at the influences of custom and convention, so with this one, custom is a long established way of doing something that over time has acquired the force of law, whereas a convention describes something that has been done for so long that it is like an unwritten rule. So if you look at things like international law, they have these sort of customary things like protection for ambassadors and those types of things, diplomatic immunity, those are customs. Those are something that you don't necessarily have to protect, but everybody does because it's always been that way. If we look at social and political philosophy, social movements and political philosophies have also influenced Canadian laws. You also have things like, the events like the Holocaust, Civil Rights Movement, the Great Depression. These are massive and important social and political events that have changed the way we think about society. And some of the secondary sources of law, we have current laws enshrined in society's values, written rules and regulations that are made by judges and legislators. We know that judges can make up their own minds, and sometimes that's really good, sometimes that's not so good. Those will get challenges, but the government does not tell them what to do. That's the point. There's supposed to be separation between the judicial and the government. Judges have judicial independence. We like this idea because we don't nominate and we don't elect judges or we don't elect court officials, and we're not supposed to do that because we want them to act independently for the common good of society. When we look at this, there are 3 secondary sources of law, and we'll take a look at these in the next couple slides. We look at the Constitution, statutes or acts, and case or common law. So those are the things we want to take another look at here. So if we look at constitutional law, this is the body of laws that set out how the country will be governed. This comes from our Canadian Constitution, of course, patriated in 1982, and sets out the distribution of power between provincial and federal governments. There are reasons that, like healthcare is a provincial matter and education is a provincial matter, whereas national security is a federal matter. So this is a division of power and how the government is going to basically take care of us. Statute law is law written by provincial or federal government, and case law or common law. This is a type of law that is based on following previous judicial decisions that is common to all people of a country. So, for example, if a judge decides that Mr. Kostick should be sentenced to 7 years of hard labor because he gives his law class too much homework, then that decision is recorded and followed the next time a different law teacher gives their class too much homework. So we have this practice of following a previous decision. We refer to this as stare decisis. When cases are decided based on previous cases, consistency and predictability are something that we can build into our legal system. So we want things to be consistent. So what really changes our law then? So we have demography, technology, values, and so with demographic changes, these are relating to birth and death rates or trends in things like immigration or education and employment. If we look at an example at Canada in the 1900s, most people lived in rural rather than urban communities. Few women worked to help support their families, whereas today, most people live in urban centers, and in most households, both spouses work to help support their family. So as we transition from rural to urban centers, laws were passed to ensure safer working environments for people, things like motor vehicle safety, legislation was enacted. Laws and regulations were passed to raise standards in sanitation, public health, housing, so that workers could have cleaner and safer places to live. This is all reaction to the fact that cities were building up and people were moving into these urban centers. If we look at technology, the technology is changing so rapidly that the law is having a very difficult time keeping up. So all these changes create new laws, or the need for new laws. Things like the internet has created a massive need for some new legislation and new laws. How do we try these things? What do we do with things like cyber hacking? What do we do with internet stalking? What do we do with some of these laws? And how do we change to reflect some of these new developments in technology? New laws have been introduced over the years that make it clear as to which level of government has jurisdiction over things like radios and television broadcasting. But other things like mobile phones and the online presence, those are different things that had to be built into newer laws. So if we look at the way values impact society, so values are a very important one, because the law is supposed to be a reflection of what the people want, and the morals and values of the people should be reflected in their government. So what happens is that people can get together, or they bring issues to the attention of the government by themselves or through lobby groups, and this can create changes in law. Think about things like smoking laws, drinking and driving, going green. Like, individuals can also change the law. So we have people like Sue Rodriguez or Morgenthaler. These are people who individually drove changes for Canadian law. We'll talk a bit about some of these people a little bit later on. And the last condition we would look at for something that changes law is this idea of emergencies. So laws are passed as a response to national emergencies. So, for example, you have something like the War Measures Act. This was passed first in World War I as a response to the emergency of the Great War. So within World War I and World War II, you give the government different legal powers. You also have the October crisis and the FLQ in the 1970s. Right? So these are different things that are in response to national emergencies. 9/11 created a whole host of new laws and legal challenges for the Canadian government and the American government in particular. Right? So how do we deal with some of these changes? The last thing we want to think about here in terms of the basis of our laws, this is just the overall concept of the rule of law. This goes all the way back to 1215, where the Magna Carta was signed by King John because he was abusing his power, and it's the fundamental principle that everybody is equal under the law. The king does not get a separate set of rules. The leader of the country does not get a separate set of rules. The peasant does not get a separate set of rules. Everybody follows the same rules. In principle, this is how our legal system is supposed to work. We know, of course, that in some cases, maybe people who are wealthier or more prominent might get slightly different treatment, but the concept is that everyone is supposed to be equal under the law. And this is something we need to keep in mind when we talk about sort of the justness and fairness of our laws and of our legal system. This is something that is fundamental and absolutely inseparable from our government and from our laws. Keep that in mind as we go throughout the course, guys, because this is a really important concept. Okay, so hopefully you got some insight into the basics of our legal system, the who, what, when, where, how, and why of law, and a little bit of intro to some of the concepts of how we change law and how do we develop law. So keep some of these things in mind as we go throughout this course. Hopefully this helped you out. Thanks for watching.